Australia's ute tax has now passed. This is slightly old news at this point, given that it passed in mid-May. However, I've not previously covered it, so I thought I'd give you my thoughts about this train wreck of a policy. So let's start with how exactly this so-called ute tax operates. Well, it operates by imposing a penalty on manufacturers if their vehicles emit too much carbon per kilometre travelled on average. Now, specifically, each year there is a carbon limit imposed on how much carbon different types of vehicles are allowed to emit without there being a penalty. The carbon limit is lowered every year in order to try to force manufacturers to improve fuel economy. For example, for ordinary lighter type vehicles, so for example Toyota Camrys and the like, the limit is going to be 141 grams per kilometre in 2025, which will fall to 58 grams per kilometre in 2029. It is more than halving. For other commercial or carrying style vehicles, the limit is 210 grams per kilometre in 2025, falling to 180 grams in 2026, and then 110 grams in 2029. Again, it is effectively halving. The penalty level is also indexed, so it starts off at $100 per gram, but then it goes up over time with inflation. Notably, Australia's government likes to index things when it raises taxes, but not when it would alleviate bracket creep, which is slightly hypocritical, but nevertheless it appears set to raise more and more money over time. Now of course there is some nuance. First, the penalty is assessed on a fleet-wide or sale-wide basis, so it is the weighted average of the carbon per kilometre emitted in essence. Second, commercial vehicles and heavier vehicles can have a higher carbon limit, and there is a mass adjustment factor. These all add complexity to the actual penalty that would be imposed, which makes the formula a little bit opaque to look at. The formula for determining penalties is, like I've indicated, slightly complex, but the intuition is that vehicles that are deemed to be more polluting are hit with heavier penalties, and the penalties increase significantly over time. But a manufacturer can offset some of this by also selling cleaner cars or EVs. Furthermore, the penalties are only based on carbon emitted per kilometre. They're not based on the life cycle of potential pollution, such as in manufacturing or disposal. So let's put some numbers on this. According to news, a Hilux Rogue emits 220 grams per kilometre. If Toyota only sold Hiluxes, we could see that the penalties would work as follows. In 2025, the ceiling is 210 grams per kilometre, so the Hilux is slightly above that ceiling by 10 grams per kilometre. Given that there's a penalty of $100 per gram, then the penalty per Hilux is $1,000. The penalty would increase with inflation and would be an inflation-adjusted $11,000 in 2029, due to the ceiling falling to 110 grams per kilometre. Obviously, this then will be increased by inflation. Ironically, to some extent, the higher inflation is, the more revenue government will raise. And in the case, Toyota could also partly offset this penalty if it were to sell fuel-efficient vehicles. For example, a Camry emits only 96 grams per kilometre, which is below the current limit of 141 grams per kilometre. Therefore, Toyota could sell some of these Camrys to offset the Hiluxes. So in essence, you can try to diversify your fleet to reduce your penalty, but there are really going to be quite some limits, especially if some cars are more popular with consumers than others. This may be to try to incentivize manufacturers to lower prices on Camrys and the like, but in reality it is likely to be operationalized by increasing the prices on things such as Hiluxes. Manufacturers are hardly going to actually lower prices. They're going to increase prices to pass things on, which they've already indicated is going to be the case. Now, there are several very clear problems with this ute tax. The first one is that the legislation is clearly inflationary. It will clearly push up prices because it increases the costs of manufacturing and sales to those manufacturers. This is obvious. There is a penalty. The penalty is going to be passed on to the extent manufacturers can. They might not be able to pass on the full amount of the penalty, but they will pass on at least some of it. This at a time where there's a cost of living crisis and the government pretends to be focusing on that cost of living crisis. Prices, therefore, on cars are going to increase. This directly leads to inflation right now. And this is not just a one-off temporary change to a newer higher base. Rather, there is a structural increase that will push up prices through until 2029, whereupon prices will implicitly stagnate at this newer, higher base. Prices are going to increase for several years. This is clearly inflationary. The duplicitousness of this tax is plain for all to see. The government has pretended to do something about cost of living with things such as energy subsidies. However, these subsidies are a one-off decrement that reverses in 12 months, whereupon you will get inflation due to the mechanical rise. Furthermore, they did nothing to slow the growth rate in energy prices from this temporarily suppressed level. In essence, that energy subsidy does nothing to effectively help inflation. However, to the extent they are doing anything here, they are more than offsetting it by increasing the prices of cars. And let's also be clear, the prices of used cars will also increase as a result. Because if newer cars have reset to a higher base, well now people can sell their used cars for slightly more money, so they will do so used car prices will also go up. It is very clear. This legislation could also in theory be extended to used cars, however that has not yet occurred. It would only do so indirectly. There's also a related issue about the carbon thresholds. They appear to be Herculean. They are expecting that the carbon per kilometre will effectively halve within 5 years. The threshold for ute vehicles is 210 grams per kilometre, but it falls to 110 grams in 5 years. The Hilux is already above that ceiling, let alone getting there in the 5 years' time. That 110 grams per kilometre is only slightly more than what a Camry currently emits. It appears the bill was written with the naive belief that technology would magically advance so rapidly as to enable fuel-efficient vehicles, and that infrastructure would magically appear to make EVs viable. But without infrastructure, how exactly are EVs going to be a viable choice, for example, for construction workers, for example, for long-distance travelers, for example, for farmers that need to haul heavy loads? Because when you're hauling a heavy load, the range on your EV falls dramatically. And that's something that appears to be omitted from a lot of the EV range figures. They're not really very apt to heavy-duty commercial use, at the moment anyway, and it would appear to be a Herculean task to get there within the 5 years. Now, the government has not indicated where exactly this infrastructure will materialize, who will fund it, and also what the government will do about grid capacity and reliability. Because if everyone has an EV, those EVs need to recharge, and the recharging requires grid capacity and reliability to be able to do so. And there does not appear to be a plan here for actually fixing that up. The bill also fails to consider life cycle emissions. There is a live argument, of course, about whether EVs are cleaner or dirtier to manufacture. However, there is certainly an argument to be had, and they're certainly not the same. It might well be that EVs are cleaner to manufacture, in which case the internal combustion engines should get an even greater penalty according to the logic of this bill. It's naive, however, to assume that all cars are the same level of cleanliness to manufacture, or that they will necessarily have the same life cycle and life limit as traditional internal combustion engines, for example. Therefore, if the government really cared about global environmental cleanliness, as opposed to, for example, appearing to do something, they would incorporate full life cycle emissions and pollution. Ideally, they would also consider human rights issues involved in the source materials. Now, EV proponents might well argue that EVs are in fact better to manufacture than internal combustion cars, and they might also argue that maybe the human rights issues are better than with internal combustion cars, and disposal and reuse is easy with EVs, and the replacing batteries isn't polluting. They might argue that that is the case, in which case the internal combustion cars should get an even greater penalty. However, we also need to note that not all EVs are created equal. Some are clearly going to be more polluting to create than others. So therefore, good faith EV proponents would presumably want to lionize and promote the cleaner made EVs. If one truly cares about the environment, then surely one would also consider that aspect of manufacturing. The net result, therefore, is an inflationary law with significant blind spots and rather Herculean assumptions. The law is really not fit for purpose and has some significant negative side effects. Things that have been well canvassed, but the government doesn't actually seem to care about. But let me know your thoughts about the ute tax in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think about it.